I guess to fulfill some sort of R. Kelly fantasy that deer have. So a few weeks ago, as I was closing on my new garage and the house that came with it, I learned something fairly interesting about the property. Apparently, 20 or so years ago, this land was actually a kangaroo farm, which is a fairly strange use of some North Atlanta property. Of course, now it seems like a thing of the past. I haven't seen any of them hopping around lately, and I suppose now Sonny the Lamboa here is the most exotic resident of the property. That being said, there are some cousins of those kangaroos that still wander about. We have a few dozen deer that we see in the backyard often. Even though we're not a long way out of town, the driveway is fairly long, and sometimes I do have to slow and wait for a deer or three to cross it before I can get my way out of the driveway. And they seem to know no fear, and that's a little bit terrifying to me because, quite honestly, I've had some bad experiences. Now, I'm sure it won't come as much of a shock to hear that I'm not much of an outdoorsman, I'm not a hunter, and the friends that do describe the experience of hunting don't actually make it sound that appealing. They sound like they're just up in some tree for many hours, freezing early in the morning, dressed in camouflage, waiting for some deer to walk by while you've covered yourself in their urine, I guess to fulfill some sort of R. Kelly fantasy that deer have, and then you shoot them. And of course, they describe it as though they're performing some community service by thinning out the population of these things, and they say that if they don't do this, that inevitably they'll just take over civilization and we won't be able to proceed along the roads without hitting them. And now, of course, I have experienced some evidence of this. Back in June of 2006, I had bought my first Lamborghini, a 2004 Gallardo in Giallo Midas, pearl yellow. And I had bought it as a 20-year-old college student, like I've talked about a bit. And of course, I didn't have any money. This was a time when you could just state your theoretical income. And if you could also fog a mirror, you could pretty much get an exotic car loan. And so I got this car literally with no more money left to make the payment. So I immediately started renting it out. And I had a good bit of success. I did a lot of business and rented the car a lot and just had a lot of good luck. And in fact, one of the main things that I'd rent the car for was weddings. People loved the idea of having some interesting car to drive away from a wedding in. And so my wife and I, even though we were just dating at the time and still very young, we had tons of friends that were always getting married. So it seemed like almost every weekend we had to go to some wedding somewhere. And when possible, I would like to take the Gallardo so that all our friends and the people that were at the wedding would start to associate exotic cars with weddings, even though, as we've all learned, that tends to not remain the case very long after a new marriage. But at that time, I stored the Lamborghini at my parents' house. And so we'd gone there to pick it up. And this would have been in like November of 2006. And we had probably driven a mile away from their house when out of the corner of my eye, I saw this gigantic monster of a deer with huge horns galloping up next to the Lamborghini. And so I started to slow down, but right behind me, there's an Infiniti. And at the time, it was much more of a novelty to see an exotic car on the road. And so most of the time they were taking pictures with some 0.5 megapixel flip phone. And I had seen many near accidents in the prior couple of months as people were taking pictures of my car. So you didn't want to surprise them too much and jam on the brakes too badly, but I needed to get slowed down to minimize the chance of hitting this deer. And I must have been going 30, 40 miles an hour at the time. It was a small surface street, and I slowed down and I'm almost stopped, definitely under 10 miles an hour, when this clumsy, stupid deer trips over itself and falls in front of the car. And I just barely hit him. He slides probably 75 or 100 feet and just hops right up, shakes it off, looks at me, and gallops off into the thicket to presumably procreate some more nuisance animals. And at the moment of impact, my wife had reacted just hysterically, not unlike the 6 or 7-year-old kid that had been walloped by the Aventador airbag in the accident I had a few years after that. But she was just going nuts, and the only thing she was able to get out is like, I thought it was coming in here. And it's one of those moments where you really want to get the crayons and the construction paper out and ask her to diagram exactly how this gigantic sleigh-pulling monster with its horns is going to come flying through space and go through this steeply raked windshield that must only open up to the outside world about 6 or 8 inches when looking from ahead, and go full Tommy boy on the interior of our Lamborghini. But eventually I did kind of get her calmed down. I pulled off the road and hopped out of the Lamborghini to go assess what the damage was. And fortunately, it was very confined. It was just the bumper cover, and it had broken a little piece off, and so I just pulled it all the way off so that we could drive it about about the mile home. The car never stalled or anything else, and we'd had to have several discussions in the prior months about what you do if you come across an animal on the road, because I'd been with her in the car a couple of times where she would see a squirrel and just react in full evasion maneuver and nearly run off the road. And I said, look, I know you don't want to hurt any animals, but whether it's a squirrel or a golden retriever or a deer, generally your best approach is just going to be to plow right through the thing, because responding at the last minute with abrupt steering like a first-time autocrosser is probably going to do more damage than actually hitting whatever the animal is. And the responses of other motorists are also something to be concerned about. So I get the car towed over the next day to the body shop, and they get it fixed. Of course, it's still $35,000, but they do it pretty fast. Fortunately, I get the car back and rent it out again before I have to make my payment. So everything ended up working out pretty well until a few months later, of course, when that car was being rented on a longer term basis to a customer in Florida that was very abusive to it, and they blew up the motor. So it lived a pretty hard life, that car, as we certainly have experienced the stories of. And around that time, the custom in the exotic car world was not to take pictures of your damaged car. This idea of capturing exactly the extent of whatever happened was kind of foreign at the time. Now, of course, we understand that with Carfax and AutoCheck and everything else documenting what happens to these cars, a lot of times having a picture that says, look, it was just the bumper cover, here's the deer blood, it's not that big of a deal, would help a lot. Now, of course, that accident never even made it on Carfax, but a few years later, when the ex-cop that crashed it before selling Lucky my 612, that one did show up with moderate damage, and the extent of the damage was very similar, still about $35,000, but it would be great to have pictures to show, look, it wasn't that big of a deal. But of course, fortunately, that was the first and only time that I hit a deer in a car, but I seem to have been haunted by them ever since. And obviously at that moment, I told all my friends that were hunters, like, please take this bounty, go find some yellow paint covered horned monster so that I can chop its head off and put it on my wall with some shards of Lamborghini bumpers sticking out of it. But I never received such a trophy or a souvenir of the thing. But a few months later, I added another car to the supercar rentals fleet. It was a Ferrari 360 Spider, and I was purchasing it out of South Florida. So I flew down there to pick the car up and drive it home. And I made it all the way 600-700 miles home, uneventful, no problems, no issues. And of course, about a mile from my parents' house where I was going to store the car, I come across another deer. And it's the middle of the night, there's no other cars, it's just standing in the middle of the road, staring at me. I slow down and proceed towards it and get almost all the way up to it before it decides to meander off the road. And I proceed past carefully and get the car parked, and I'm like, what are they doing to me? And a couple years after that, while I was working at the Lamborghini dealership, when Lamborghini forgot they'd left one of the early Superleggera press cars with me, and I was driving it all the time, probably put 2,500 or so miles on it before they picked it back up to finally let Road and Track drive it for a little while. A lot of what I did was take it up to the mountains. And one weekend, I'd taken the car home, and my wife and I decided to run up Tail of the Dragon and just have some fun driving around in the North Georgia and Tennessee mountains. And on the way back, it was pitch black dark, no more cars on the road, and 3 times deer come out in front of us, stop in the middle of the road, and just stare. And eventually they scamper off. But the third one waited literally until I got almost all the way up to it, slowing down obviously, until it just stared at me, desiring to avenge the injuries I must have caused to its brother several years earlier in another yellow Lamborghini. And finally and reluctantly, he wanders off the road. And so I don't know if they're all looking to be the martyr to make up for whatever I did to that one, but I have not been able to figure it out. But it was a very spooky thing, but nothing compared to about a year after that, right after the day, in fact, that we'd completed all the repairs to the prostitute Gallardo that I had just bought. It would spend about 20 grand making it all reasonably nice as that car was ever going to be. And my wife and I decided to leave after work and drive down to Florida and see some friends. And so we left, and about midnight we got down to Orlando and get on the turnpike. And of course my wife is well asleep at this point, and it's just me on the road, and I'm going along. But as we got south of Orlando, I saw the strangest thing. Literally lining the turnpike, a few feet off the shoulder, were hundreds, if not thousands, of deer. They weren't mating, they weren't eating, they weren't doing anything except watching me. I slowed at 30, 40 miles an hour, just waiting on one to dart out, and they don't move. It's like they're just deer statues hanging out by the road. I did see some of them move enough to convince me that it wasn't some prank being played by the state of Florida to get people to slow down on the turnpike, but it was terrifying. I mean, they're just right there looking like they're ready to draw straws for who's going to hit the blue Lamborghini. So I go at least a couple miles of this, just constant deer on the side of the road, and I don't wake my wife up. I wish I had, just so someone else could say that they also saw this strange phenomena, but it was nuts. Probably easily the most terrifying and spooky thing I've ever seen happen in a car. But fortunately, I emerged from that unscathed, and we got down to Florida and had fun in Kimmy's old Gallardo. So in the wake of all this, I will confess that in the late fall, early winter, when I'm driving around on small roads, I take it pretty easy when I'm in an exotic car. I know that's the time that these deer go into full Discovery Channel Caligula party mode, and I don't really want to be a casualty of their idiocy during this window of time. But of course, I hope that if you find yourself impacting one of these beasts in your interesting car, that you find a way to get them back a little more efficiently than I've been able to, and that you don't find yourself haunted by them forever. VINwiki is proud to be partnering with mobile app Hero to continue changing the way we look at documenting automotive history. We're working with them to bring updates to our mobile and web-based app, so stay tuned to their social media and ours and keep telling the stories of all the cars you love.